Welcome to tonight's head-to-head talk, Climate Adaptations, Local and Global. My name is Marion Danzeisen. I'm the Deputy Director and Cultural Program Manager at the German-American Center in Stuttgart, and I'm honored to welcome you all, also on behalf of the American Academy. Thank you, Julian, for hosting us in Berlin, and also the Hospitalhof, of course, in Stuttgart, where we were supposed to be tonight. So thank you, everyone, for being here. The head-to-head series is also supported by the Holzbrink Publishing Group and the Bertolt Leidinger Stiftung GmbH. And so we would like to thank them especially for their generosity and their support of this program. If you don't know that yet, in the series, we meet 3 to 4 times a year where we bring a fellow from the American Academy together with an expert here in Stuttgart. And tonight we are pleased to have Cymene Howe and Sophie Mok here with us to discuss ways in which both cities and communities are adapting to climate change locally and globally. So welcome. Just a very brief introduction of our 2 speakers. You're going to learn much more about them in the course of this event. Professor Howe is a cultural anthropologist at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Her research has focused on environment inequalities and the anthropology of climate change. She holds a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD from the University of New Mexico. And she is currently, as I said, a fellow at the Academy, working on a project called Melt Rise, where she looks at the social impacts of climate change. And I think we're going to learn more about that tonight as well. And Sophie Mok joined the Nature Conservancy in Europe in 2022 as a project manager on the Europe urban greening team, where she supports the city of Stuttgart in developing new nature-based solutions through a local climate innovation fund. She's also a senior researcher in the Urban Systems Engineering Department of the Fraunhofer Institute for Industrial Engineering and has worked on various research projects for sustainable urban development, climate resilience, and urban farming. So as you can see, we have 2 fabulous experts to talk to us about something that everyone should care about, the climate. And just a few housekeeping notes. We are going to start with 2 short keynotes. So we're going to start with Sophie Mok for the local perspective, and then we're going to move to Cymene for the global perspective, and then kind of move into a discussion. So for everyone at home, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function so that we can incorporate them. And yeah, so with no further ado, I would like to thank everyone again for being here and hand it over to our 2 speakers. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much, Marion, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to join you here today on this interesting session and discussion, hopefully later on. Let me try to share my screen. Okay, so I was asked to give a bit insights into a local perspective to climate adaptation. And since I'm supporting TNC in the Europe Urban Greening Program, especially with our partner, the city of Stuttgart, I'll focus a lot on the urban perspective and kind of what cities can do or what they are currently doing in terms of adapting to the impacts of climate change. And well, we were obviously hoping to have this in person today in Stuttgart, so you might have had a bit of a look around to the city, but for those of you who don't know it yet, Stuttgart is the capital of the state of Baden-Württemberg, and it's, I would say, rather known for its automotive industry, with lots of car manufacturers and their supply chains being based here. So it's also a rather wealthy city in that sense. It has a geographic particularity, which is that it is surrounded by hills. So the city center kind of lays in a small valley dent. And therefore, when it rains, all the water is kind of flowing towards city center, and also the heat kind of gets trapped down between the different hills in city center. So actually Stuttgart is being projected as the city that will become the hottest city of Germany in a few years. So definitely this is an issue that the city administration and many actors here are working on and working towards. And this is also why there are several, let's say, on the ground and strategic works happening, which I'll try to provide you with a short insight with. So just recently, to also maybe show you a few numbers of what we are actually talking about, the city has conducted a study on what will be the largest impacts and climate risks for Stuttgart in the coming years. And they looked at how these risks will evolve until 2035 and 2050. And you can see the first two that are highlighted are actually the risks that have been identified as the main ones, which is one, heat. So we are talking about up to 70 heat days per year in 2050, if the trends continue as right now. And also up to 50% rainier winter. So also heavy rainfall and flooding is one of the issues that the city is, well, most vulnerable to, I would say. Obviously, there are also other climate-related impacts, such as storms, fires, droughts that will also, impact the urban environment and stakeholders and most of all, obviously, the inhabitants then that live in the urban area. So what is the city's response to this? I have the, let's say, privilege to be based, so since 2022, when I joined, at the local climate task force of the municipality. And there are two main strategies which the city has to kind of, as a response to these challenges, which is first of all, the climate adaptation concept, which is led by the Office of Environmental Protection. And it's perhaps quite interesting that Stuttgart has had the first Office of Urban Climatology in the administration itself. So it was one of the first cities to hire a meteorologist to join city administration and actually work on these issues. And at that time, it also finalized as one of the first cities, the urban climate adaptation strategy, which summarized different actions that a city is already undertaking or will need to implement in the future to adapt to climate change. And this has been done in a large co-creation process with different municipal departments and public entities, such as, for instance, the departments for forestry, for the environment, also public utilities like water suppliers, for instance, so many different actors. And it is building on the German adaptation strategy, but then contextualizing it to actual activities undertaken in the city itself. And as you can see, 2012 is quite a long time ago. So this concept is currently being updated. So there is a revision process where actually all of these measures are being updated to status quo and then also being enhanced based on the knowledge that we have up to date, such as the insights that I've shown you before. And in parallel to that, there has been a recent study that has been developed by the Climate Task Force, which is also a municipal body that has been rather recently installed. So it's in place for about 3 years now and directly below the mayor as a strategic, let's say, task force and it looks at both, so climate mitigation and adaptation. So the strategy, which is called the climate roadmap, that is under development, it has two goals. First of all, the city council has decided the goal of trying to reach net zero emissions in the urban territorial balance by 2035. And also at the same time, it looks at building resilience and adaptation measures. So also to kind of see what are the, let's say, cross-cutting interactions between these two goals. So there has been a study, this has been developed jointly with McKinsey and Company. So there was a public-private partnership to actually also focus a bit on what would be the investments needed to actually implement all the measures to reach the net zero goal and build resilience, and what could be the actual potential savings in future. And this was one of the findings of the study, that basically, even though there are obviously lots of investments that would be needed to implement these measures, already by the mid-2040s, there could be a break even in terms of that the savings cover the investment that is initially needed. So this was also kind of a argument of the roadmap to convince city council and also different actors to go ahead and join forces to actually reach these goals, because obviously this is not a thing that the municipality itself is able to perform, but it actually needs the whole society in terms of inhabitants, companies, municipality, public entities to join forces to really make this happen. So currently, this roadmap is being set up organizationally, but also kind of to think about monitoring structures and how to spread responsibilities to really get this operationalized. So this is the current process here. And this is perhaps just to show you how, such a strategy could look in a nutshell. So you would have the different dimensions that are being, and the risks that we are looking at. It evaluates different action fields which serve to address these risks. And then it assesses basically the current status of these action fields. So if they are sufficiently addressed, if they are perhaps lacking still, so no measures are undertaken today. And it goes then into individual really action points and who is supposed to be taking care of them with responsibilities and so on. So this is just an overview to show you. And I think from here, I would like to take you to one specific measure, which I'm involved in, and which is being implemented in cooperation with the Nature Conservancy. And so here I would like to just quickly introduce to you what the Nature Conservancy is and how it comes that we are actually working together with the city of Stuttgart on these issues. When I joined initially, I wasn't familiar with the Nature Conservancy at all, which lots of people in Europe are not. In America, this is a totally different story. And so actually it's the largest nature conservation organization in the world, and it has started to also build up a Europe program. So by now it has offices in Berlin, Brussels, and London, and a bit over 50 staff members. And it's the fastest growing. So it's, becoming more and more known here as well, I would say. But as you can see here, in this area, there are different, let's say, focus points and areas that TNC is engaging with, which involve large portions of climate protection of land and water systems, but also building healthy cities. And out of these priorities, I would say a pilot project was initiated, or pilot program as such, which is called the Europe Urban Greening Program, which specifically targets cities, which is a bit exotic in terms of nature conservation work, because usually we focus on large national areas and lands, but then cities are very specific biotopes, and it's a first, I would say, for TNC to really look into these areas, but it has started 2020 and for now already gained 2 partner cities, which is one Berlin and the second one is Stuttgart. And the initial thought was really to implement strategies and initiate demonstration projects around nature-based solutions to promote climate adaptation, because it's one of the biggest priorities or one of the goals of TNC to also contribute to climate adaptation and livelihoods of people, which obviously to a large extent live in cities. And the program wanted to, at that time, also kind of identify critical barriers towards urban greening in cities and nature in cities, so to speak, and kind of find ways to overcome these and promote the uptake of more green infrastructure in municipal planning, and to also foster the exchange between different cities on these and create visibility for best practices, really start building up expertise in this area. And the interesting part is that TNC approached this by saying we work very closely with different cities. We really focus on their own needs and barriers that they currently see. And we have a certain budget that we can support them with, but we also support them with expertise. So we don't only provide money, but we actually have a person, in this case, with the partnership with Stuttgart, this person is me, who can actually support the city on taking on this extra work, because often for administrations, everything that comes on top is hard to manage. And that also brings the capacity and the whole link to the expertise that is within TNC to the table. So it's a, I would say, form of public-private partnership or public partnership, where the cooperation between the Climate Task Force in Stuttgart and the Urban Greening Program has resulted in a specific funding line, which I'm going to present to you now. So this is a program which the city has established to promote innovations in climate change, because they have seen that it's, as one of the measures, it was listed as a priority that we wanted, or the city wanted to promote also the development of new solutions in this area. And it has put a substantial budget of 13 million euros into a climate innovation fund, which is a municipal fund, for projects that kind of develop innovative solutions to address both climate mitigation or adaptation. And it's so far the largest, I think, municipal fund for climate innovations in the whole of Europe. And so projects can apply with up to 90% subsidy for their undertaking. And there is a sort of an impact-based payment scheme. So they apply with different goals that they want to reach. And once they reach the goals, they get parts of their costs supported through the city itself. So far, because this has been a pilot as well, there have been 5 funding rounds here, and we support about 35 projects that are currently running here in Stuttgart. And it's really by different organizations. So we have grassroots initiatives that come with their ideas. We do have startups, we do have NGOs, corporates, So even different municipal departments that want to try out new things and need budget for it. So it's a wide variety of actors that we try to reach, and yeah, also to enable them to connect with each other and yeah, build up a new, I would say, climate community and movement with new ideas locally. And there is a Climate Innovation Council, which actually selects these projects or the proposals that are to be funded. And it's basically set up with local experts in this area. And this is also, I mean, we have a person from Bosch in there. We have different persons from research institutes, such as the Fraunhofer Institute, where I worked before, and universities, but also influencers in the area. So it's a very different, I would say, constellation, and they jointly yeah, select the projects to be funded. There are different criteria. So obviously we look at climate impact itself. We look also at innovation. So that is kind of a new approach. This doesn't have to be technical. It could also be social innovation, or a new business model that is supposed to be tried out. So this is very broad definition. And we also look at certain visibility, scalability, so that it's not only a small pilot that will be then there, but there's also a potential for this to really kick off and have a larger impact at the end. And through the cooperation with the Nature Conservancy, there was a specific funding line established last year with a budget of 3 million euros, which are actually reserved and dedicated only for projects to address climate adaptation issues through nature-based solutions. So it's open for applicants from all over Europe, but the project obviously has to happen in Stuttgart itself. I will show you a few of the examples of projects that we have granted support so far. Yeah, before I go into this, what are nature-based solutions? Because this is a question I often get. It's actually a term that is largely used and promoted by the European Commission as yeah, solutions that are inspired and supported by nature and address different challenges. We here in Stuttgart rather try to keep it simple and just say we are actually looking for new approaches to bring back nature to the cities, to have a better relationship, people and nature that share basically the same environment where they live in. And we want to also harvest the potential of blue and green infrastructure, so plants and water bodies, to actually build climate resilience and create a more livable urban environment also in the future. So especially in terms of heat island prevention, also the cooling function of plants, be it with shading or evaporation. We want to deseal more surfaces, have more permeability in urban areas so that urban water can be better managed. And it's not all, you know, surface flow. And obviously nature-based solutions, they also provide different co-benefits than, be it air quality, which is a large issue in Stuttgart as well, since traffic is quite horrible. But also promote biodiversity and create new habitats and have an effect on health and well-being of the people itself. So down here you can see some of the examples of what nature-based solutions could be, from building related nature to street trees, to really, let's say, parks, daylighting rivers, so different measures that fall under this category. And we have currently 4 projects in that we are funding after this year. This is a picture of one of them, which is called the Wild Climate Wall. It's a new innovative facade greening technique and structure, which is being piloted at the university campus. So they take an existing building and they establish this wall of over, I think, 60 square meters, which is quite rich in terms of the plants that they select, and they select lots of flowering plants to be planted there. And they also look at habitat structures for insects and birds and bats, so different animal groups as well. And they do a monitoring of how biodiversity changes, how it's accepted also in this urban area, and what effects this climate wall has on the surrounding temperature and also on the inside of the building, so in terms of insulation. So there will be a monitoring process here. And the wall is currently being installed. It should be ready and ready to visit, more or less, I think, end of May. So if any of you is planning to visit Stuttgart, it could be, one of the trips to go and see it. On a very different note, there is one project that we support, which comes rather from an art movement. So it's a consulting group that looks at developing a new greening movement, where they also try out a new participation and decision-making models for greening initiatives. So if there is a block, for instance, of houses, and they have a area which belongs to different owners. This is often a very tricky situation in cities because the ownership structure is not very clear. And if a place is to be unsealed, many different owners perhaps have a say in it. So they want to try to find a new moderation and decision-making process here to come to a joint solution, and also install a pilot greening, actually 10 different pilot greening projects. And through this combination of, let's say, social interaction and decision finding and the actual installation of the greening, they kind of build up this movement and see it as a, holistic art work, which they plan to enhance and further build on. The next project goes a bit more into the governance direction. So they look at barriers that exist in complex administration structures, such as a university campus. So they really want to look at what are the barriers towards nature-based solutions from a university perspective. And through different co-creation workshops, engage with different initiatives to actually make sure these solutions are more visible on the table, and they are actually developing different blueprints for nature-based solutions on the campus, which should then be incorporated in the climate adaptation strategy of the university itself. So in Germany, it's compulsory for universities to set up a climate adaptation strategy right now. And this is the last example that I brought, which is, it was jointly applied for by a startup which develops new greening products, such as you can see here, down here, like it's a product where trees can also grow horizontally, not only vertically, amongst other, let's say, green infrastructure modules. And a company which is rather big in Stuttgart, which they sell clothes for children. And they applied together to develop a joint greening vision and catalog for a very central city in Stuttgart, which is the Schulstraße. So it's next to the marketplace, and it's rather dense. So there's not much green in here for now. And it's also 2 stories, lots of concrete. So they really want to look at what could be good solutions for this particular street, and they want to then also pilot this facade here of this building and the areas surrounding to install new greening and have some discussion with the customers and people that pass by to see how they perceive the new, let's say, design, what their thoughts are on this, and then work together with the different shop owners and restaurants in this street to enhance and build up towards the vision that they define. So also a very exciting project that's just kicked off this year. And what's next? So the Innovation Fund itself, the trial period is running out this year. There will be one more funding round in autumn. So applications deadline in autumn, basically, for project ideas. And currently also a selection round is running. So the jury will meet in June, June, to select new projects to be funded. So this is what's currently happening and what will be happening this year. And furthermore, we are trying from the TNC side and the city of Stuttgart side to provide also more community building activities, have the different projects connect with each other, and set up good structures to really support their implementation process, feed in the best practices back to the municipality and other actors that are of relevance, and also install some sort of an impact monitoring to actually see what are we achieving with this fund and with the individual projects. Are we actually reaching the target that we hope to achieve? And since this year is the year where in Stuttgart the new budget for the next 2 years are being negotiated, this is also something that's going on that we kind of have to argue for the Innovation Fund to continue and for new budget to be added for it to be continued in the coming years. So this is what we are jointly working on right now. And I think this is it. I hope I didn't go too long, but I just end with a picture of Stuttgart, how it could look. It was developed by association called Reinventing Society, who looked at, some positive images of the future. And we particularly liked this picture of Stuttgart, and this is kind of what we try to work towards in our work here. Yes, with this, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. This is really, really interesting material, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you more about this as we get our questions from people, just have a discussion ourselves. I think there's also a lot of interesting parallels with the city of Houston, where I live. So I'll be curious to kind of do some comparisons there between stormwater infrastructure, for example, green infrastructures that we have in Houston as well. Like I was saying, I think this is a really interesting, complex set of questions around adaptation and how do we implement adaptation in the most effective ways possible. It's really inspiring to see what the city of Stuttgart is doing, taking this very proactive approach to adaptation and responding to the climate crisis. I think it's really important that we work through cities. As you pointed out, more and more people, more and more of the world population will be in cities in the future. And so cities and urban centers are really central to questions about climate. So today I want to talk a bit about the research that I've been doing over the last few years, which really has to do with a larger planetary, a very global hydrosphere, and specifically a cryosphere, the ice of the world. And I'm really interested in looking at the impacts of these changing environmental conditions, the kinds of adaptations that people are exercising in different points in the world, and the kinds of interactions that we can see between human populations and quote unquote natural environments, which of course have been quite impacted and manipulated by all kinds of human intervention. So I'm curious about how those sorts of adaptations are unfolding over time and across place. So essentially the narrative or the tale I'll be telling today is a story of water that is set in motion by the warming of the world. And it will come as no surprise to you that we are seeing the acceleration of a warming world and the kinds of impacts that that has on the world's water. And so we can think about those things in terms of the future, but we can also think about those things in terms of what has already passed. So many of you will remember the catastrophic flooding across the countries of Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany, as well as other countries that occurred in the summer of 2021 that killed 243 people. 200 of those people were living in Germany. So Germany was quite impacted by these massive flooding and rain events. And we also know when we look to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the international scientific body that works to determine our future projections, that, as they put it, it is very likely that heavy precipitation, heavy rain events will intensify and also become more frequent in most regions with addition to global warming, with the addition of more global warming. And so it very much matches with the Stuttgart case that you pointed out, Sophie, where you have both more rain and a hotter city center, right? So you have that kind of heat-water nexus occurring in each of these conditions. And this is some of the destruction that came about through some of those heavy rain events that happened in Germany and other parts of Europe. We also know that very recently, Germany lost one of its only 5 glaciers. You don't have many glaciers in Germany, but you did have 5, and now there's only 4. One was lost in the summer of 2022. And so we can see these relationships between the warming Earth and a changing cryosphere. We also know that glaciers are a very important part of freshwater storage for many places on Earth, and about 2 billion people, or about a quarter of the world's population, actually depend on glaciers for drinking water and for crop irrigation. And so these cryoforms, these glaciers and ice sheets that we can find everywhere around the world are critical, not only in the sense that they indicate what's happening with climate change, but they are also reservoirs of life and vitality. They're reservoirs that are very important for future human flourishing, as well as flourishing of natural environments. We also know through the science, and this is pretty regular fare in the media now about climate change, that melting glaciers also make for rising seas. So we know that as we add more of this fresh water to the ocean system, that not only do we change the chemistry of that system by adding fresh water to salt water, we also change the temperature of that system, and we add more material essentially to that global system of the hydrosphere and the waters of the world. So we can see this direct relationship between melting glaciers and rising sea levels. If we look at a place like Germany again, we can see some of the impacts, for example, in Hamburg, where we see in 2100 in light blue, the 2 meters, which would be about 2 degrees Celsius scenario. And then we have the dark blue, which is about 3 meters of sea level rise. That's the 4 degrees Celsius scenario in terms of global warming. And this would displace over 20% of the about 400,000 people in the region. So these are extreme impacts that we can see in places like Germany, but also in many other parts of the world. And in 2021, there was a study that showed that by 2100, with 1 meter of sea level rise and no population growth, basically, that the number of people affected by rising seas could easily increase to 410 million by that time. So we see these pretty extreme potential outcomes and futures as we come to understand more clearly what the impacts of climate crisis and the climate change events are. So one of the questions I'm interested in as a cultural anthropologist, as a social scientist, is basically how we adapt, how we collectively adapt. How do we navigate these catastrophic impacts of climate disruption? And how do we ensure also that climate justice and climate equity are really central to the adaptation practices that we put into place? Also, from a kind of more analytical point of view, how do we analyze these kinds of conditions? What do we see as important or less important that have these very different effects? And how do we recognize each of these phenomena as both social and environmental in form? And to understand that we cannot easily separate the social from the environmental, because we're seeing these feedback loops more and more. And to really grasp that in a really clear conceptual way, I think is very important, that separation between sort of nature and culture, or nature and human civilizations, was never a stark line to begin with. And we're seeing that line become even fuzzier and collapse even further. So I began much of this project in thinking about the water of the world up in a northern part of the world, in the country of Iceland, with a project that I called MELT, the social life of ice at the top of the world. And here you can see Iceland down. This is a satellite picture way down in the corner there next to Greenland, which is this big white spot. And so this project really began there. And I was interested in Iceland because it's a country where about 10% of the island is covered in ice, and yet they are losing about 10 to 11 billion tons of ice every single year off the island of Iceland. And so it's a place that's facing very dramatic, very clear and visible climate changes. And I was interested in what people were thinking, how they were feeling, how they're responding, not just through infrastructure, but also through their own emotional reactions and dispositions to this radical transformation of their environment, a place where Icelanders have lived for the last 1,200 years. Since settlement in 874, they've lived with glaciers and with the largest glacial ice mass in all of Europe, Vatnajökull. So how was it that they were experiencing these changes, and what do they expect for the future? These are the kinds of questions that I would get at when talking to people. One of the things that I stumbled across along with my research partner as I was doing this work on the melting of glaciers in Iceland was I discovered that the first named glacier in Iceland had been lost to climate change. It had essentially died and had been diminished to the point where it was no longer a glacier. And it was very interesting because I really did stumble across this. It was a very, very short little news report. It was just a little over 70 words. It was a very, very minor report about this loss of Iceland's first major glacier to climate change. And to me, as an outsider, I felt this was a very important story. It was a threshold event. It was a kind of moment to capture and to crystallize in order to understand the real impacts of climate change. And yet there had been almost nothing written about it. No one was talking about it. Most Icelanders that I spoke to weren't even aware that this glacier had essentially met its end. And the other interesting thing about this little glacier is that it was called Ok. And so here you can see Ok on the map. It's spelled okay, like the English word to mean that everything's all right. And so the kind of twisted irony of this was that everything was not okay with Ok. Ok was not okay, but it was in fact quite not okay. So I thought this was a kind of important phenomenon, something to pay attention to. And so again, working with some Icelandic colleagues and artists and others, we decided to host a funeral for a glacier. So there had never been a funeral for a glacier in the history of the world that we could find. This was in the summer of 2019. We held our funeral for the glacier on top of the mountain, on top of Ok Mountain. And we installed what we called a letter to the future. It's a plaque that's written in Icelandic and in English. And this letter to the future says that Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. And in the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done, but only you know if we did it. So I think this is an important way of thinking about it as we speak to the future and to future generations who might encounter this memorial and who will certainly encounter more and more loss of the cryosphere and glaciers. This question of only you know if we did it really compels us to act in the present. I think it's an invitation to act in the present and to recognize what's occurring. So in thinking about the melting of glaciers and working on these topics, one can't help in the context of climate change and the climate crisis to go from melt to thinking about rise, to thinking about sea level rise, because it's part of this same cycle and part of the same process. So as I was thinking about these melting glaciers and doing this research, I was very curious about the other end of the spectrum, about where and how this ice now made water was becoming sea level rise and how that was impacting communities around the world. And so I began to ask the question, what if we could actually follow the water? What if we could actually follow the water from places like the Arctic, where they're heating at a much higher rate than the rest of the world, by some estimates up to between 4 and 7 times faster than the rest of the planet, where you have this massive amount of ice that's flowing into the ocean? What if we could actually follow that water to see where it leads and what it does when it gets there? So I was curious about these stories that the water might tell along its way, the stories that the water might narrate about its path. And so understanding how water has been set in motion by human-caused climate disruption may, in fact, this is my proposition, may in fact be creating new interrelationships between and among people that are otherwise distant and disconnected. So places that are otherwise seemingly very, very distant and very unconnected from one another are actually being connected through water and are being connected through the climate crisis in that way, even if they may be facing very different impacts and different effects. So I interviewed a lot of scientists trying to be able to follow the water. It turns out it's a very, very difficult scientific proposition to be able to do so. But I did come across in that time a brand new tool that had been developed by physicists at NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. It's called the Gradient Fingerprint Map. And here you see a screenshot of the fingerprint map. And what this shows us essentially is it can show us exactly where the world cities, coastal cities of the world, are receiving their meltwater from. So you can put in to this online tool one of almost 300 cities along coast all over the planet and find out where their sea level rise is coming from melted ice. And so here you have New York City, and you can see that New York City is getting quite a bit of its meltwater coming from Antarctica and the sub-Antarctic. It's getting a lot from Greenland. If you look at these blue bars, it's getting quite a bit from Greenland. Alaska is contributing quite a bit. And in the southern Andes, the glaciers of the southern Andes, the mountain range, are actually contributing quite a bit to New York City's sea level rise. So it's a very interesting tool. It's a very powerful calculation and set of physical properties that bring it together. And it shows us very, I think, counterintuitive and surprising things along the way. So when we look at this online device, we see these sort of counterintuitive outcomes. Here you see Greenland as it's melting quite a bit, and then you see Iceland there in the corner. And it's telling us some interesting tales of melted ice and rising seas. So what the gradient fingerprint map shows us is that when Iceland melts, when the ice of Iceland melts, it actually impacts the city of Cape Town, South Africa, more than any other city in the world. Now, if you think back to the globe, you'll know that these are very, very distant places, very disparate points on a map, where you have Iceland up in the far north and Cape Town all the way down by Antarctica, much more so than the Arctic. And yet the ice of Iceland is becoming sea level rise in the city of Cape Town. So this is both surprising, I think, and also interesting in the sense that it is so surprising. We also, if we look at when Greenland melts, that actually affects the city of Honolulu more than any other city in the United States. So as Greenland melts, which it is doing quite rapidly, in fact, if all of Greenland were to melt, it would add 7.5 meters to global sea level rise overall. And of course, Antarctica has even more than that if it were to melt. So as we look at these different processes of melt, we can see that they're having different impacts on certain cities. And so we have this kind of 4-part connectivity. I made this little graph to sort of show the operations of these different connectivities and the kind of comparative work that I'm interested in doing. So if we look at the comparison of adaptation that's related to the loss of the cryosphere, the melt process, we can also compare adaptation practices that are related to the expanding hydrosphere or the effects of rise. And we can compare Iceland's response in adaptation to the loss of ice as well, and compare that with Greenland and sort of get a comparison there. But we can also compare what's happening in Iceland, the sorts of practices they're undertaking, and that of Cape Town, the city that's being impacted by this melting cryosphere. And so I'm interested in these sort of cross-comparative ways of understanding adaptation and how different communities are responding. So, for example, in the fishing port of Hip, which is in Iceland, they've been facing some very dramatic changes in this important port, because essentially with the loss of ice, the island of Iceland is in fact rising up out of the sea. So we think of these small island nations in the media, they're usually spoken about as sort of appearing to kind of to shrink beneath the ocean surface, right? To kind of be submerged and go underwater. But in fact, in Iceland, we're seeing the exact opposite effect, because as the weight of the ice is relieved off the top of the island itself, and because of all the volcanic activity underneath it, the island is experiencing isostatic rebounding, this rebounding effect more dramatically than it did before. And so what that does to infrastructures like ports, if the land is rising up out of the sea, is it changes the dimensions so that certain ships can no longer come into the harbor. They're having to retrofit and rework the entire port itself, as the island of Iceland rises up out of the sea by about 2 centimeters per year. So pretty dramatic rebounding that we're seeing. And while the kinds of adaptation that places like Cape Town, the city affected by Icelandic melt, may be different, and we see here some shore hardening, trying to brace for sea level rise in communities along the beach in Cape Town, we can see that some of the qualities and some of the dimensions are similar, right? These sort of infrastructural responses. And my question is, how much political will is being invested in these projects? How much economic resources are being invested in these projects? So that even though we may have very different responses to melting ice and rising seas, we can see that there's a certain quality or depth to these practices as well. So this is Jakobshavn Glacier. It's the fastest moving glacier on Earth, and it empties out into the ice fjord at Ilulissat in Greenland. And we see that in a study from last year in August, it shows that at least 8 inches of sea level rise is already locked in for the Greenland ice sheet. That means that these are emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere have already locked in 8 inches of sea level rise, and that's from Greenland alone. So we know that Greenland is contributing quite a bit to global sea level rise. And that even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases tonight, that we would still have that locked in effect. So those are sobering things for us to think about. When we look at a place like Greenland and its loss of water, we also then want to look at a place like Honolulu, Hawaii, which is facing, of course, very dramatic sea level increases. This is a photograph that I took this past summer on one of the roads that leads into a little community just outside of Honolulu called Haula. This is basically the only road that leads into town, and as you can see, it's really suffering major structural damage and needs fortification. It's quite dangerous. Actually, just a couple of weeks before I started doing this field work here, a massive sinkhole opened up on this road as a woman was driving, and her car literally dropped into the sinkhole because there's been so much under the road erosion that's been caused by sea level rise. She was fine, but I'm sure it was terrifying. And these are the kinds of things that will undoubtedly increase in the future. I find this quote really instructive and important. This is from an indigenous scholar from Hawaii named Hi'ile Julia Hobart. She writes that water's nature is diasporic. And she says it misbehaves in such a way that it reminds humans of the limits of their own power and control. I think this is a really important figure, a really interesting approach and way of thinking about water as a kind of diasporic entity. So we often think of diaspora in terms of human populations, people who are moving in migration from one place to another, diasporic populations throughout history of all kinds. And we also think about diaspora from climate change as people become climate refugees. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that in a similar way, in a parallel way, water is also becoming diasporic in new ways and in new models as we see the melting of ice sheets and glaciers, and as we see the transformation of the world ocean. As an anthropologist, I'm also very attuned to the fact that bodies of water in general, in human communities and across human populations, have always held a very special place in our kind of collective human imaginary, because water is, in the first instance, it's a life force. We absolutely require it for our survival and for our thriving. It sustains all living beings on Earth. We literally cannot live without it. But it is also a life space. It's its own particular ecosystem. And of course, those ecosystems are different depending on fresh water or glacier water or ocean water. But so they create, water is also this life space that creates environments and provides ecosystems where organisms can live and thrive. But also in many cosmological systems, as we look around the world, we also know that bodies of water are life forms, that they are at some time, in some instances, sentient beings in their own right. And we see some really interesting work going on, for example, around the rights of nature movement, which is designating bodies of water like rivers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, like glaciers in the Himalayas, as actually having legal subjectivity and legal personhood. So the rights of nature movement is actually tapping into this idea that bodies of water, in fact, have their own almost human subjectivity. They have a kind of sentience that's important. So these are a kind of more complex and dynamic ways of thinking about the water of the world and how it's being transformed through the climate crisis, and how it might be places where we're seeing new possibilities for meaning and transformation and new possibilities emerging. So in learning the ice and following the water that is created, I've been really interested in these two heuristics that I've seen unfolding over the course of this research. The first heuristic is what scientists call the world ocean. And this is a very interesting concept to me because we often learn in school, or if we look at the globe or a map of the world, that oceans and seas are divided and named. So we have the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Indian and the Southern, et cetera. But in fact, the world hydrosphere is one interconnected body of material. And for many scientists, the thinking of the world ocean is a very important way to conceptualize it, because it allows us to see this as a very interactive, interconnected unit that has different impacts and different transformations, depending on where it comes ashore, but also the dynamics that it is able to make possible. So this concept of the world ocean is very important, also in the sense that it pushes us to see ourselves connected and interrelated through something like the world ocean and how we might be connected to it. So here's a kind of idyllic picture of the beach in Waikiki in Honolulu, Hawaii. So here you see a part of the world ocean that we call the Pacific, right? Here's a part of the Pacific. It's commonly named this part of the world ocean. But this is also the Pacific. This is again the world ocean. This is just a few miles away from that idyllic beach, and also in the city of Honolulu. And this is what they call sunny day flooding. So this is where you have sea level rise pushing up the water table from underneath the streets and through the drainage pipes, in creating essentially these inland urban lakes that occur during king tides and certain high tides throughout the course of the year. So this is a very industrial part of Honolulu, not the beautiful sort of touristy Waikiki beach. But nonetheless, this is the world ocean. This is the Pacific. as it's being transformed by climate change, and it's rising up through the streets in its own fashion. So the second kind of conceptual space or heuristic that I'm interested in is something I'm calling hydrological globalization. So hydrological globalization is really an idea that I want to use in order to draw attention to how we're all intimately and sometimes strangely connected through water, through the planetary hydrosphere, and through the world ocean as it's transformed. So while we may have always been linked to each other and always through to one another through water in one way or another as a life force, my proposition is that climate change and the climate crisis is both accelerating and also extending that relationship of connectivity. So it attunes us to the sort of watery connections, the watery interrelationships that we have as human beings, in this case in the form of meltwater and rising seas, but also in the case of extreme rain, which of course is exacerbated by warming seas and by more water in the ocean, the world ocean, as well as floods, overflowing rivers, and then the obverse of that, which is desertification and drought. So these are all part of a larger hydrological cycle, all intimately connected and interacting betwixt and between these different spaces. So for me, thinking through globalization in different terms, not just in terms of trade or the globalization of the marketplace, or in terms of migration, or in terms of financial flows, or in terms of media that's distributed, all the kind of common ways we think of globalization. I want to really begin to think about globalization as at once physical property, the transformation of water because of climate change, but also one that can bring us into a closer connection between our human habits, our human practices, and the kinds of impacts that's having in our ecosystems and environments. So where does this take us? For one, I think it really shows us the importance of bringing the social sciences, disciplines like anthropology and sociology, political science, together with the natural sciences, like the physics, the physicists who are able to create these incredible climate models, like the gradient fingerprint map, but also oceanographers and other marine biologists, people who are working in the physical sciences, to really understand the full picture, the full complete image of what's occurring in our world. And it's important that we work together on these projects. And I think it also leads it to different cultural forms that helps us to sort of collectively tell different stories about the climate crisis, and to think more profoundly and perhaps even more politically, more efficaciously around the kinds of stories that we need to understand in order to enact the kind of changes that we absolutely need to continue to do. So while climate adaptation is, as our presentation tonight has said, and that Sophie is really wisely pointing out too, it's both local and global in scale. But it's also the case that the local is connected into and through the global in ways that we're now beginning to see more dramatically. And so let me end with this thought. Sister cities of climate change, or sister cities of the Anthropocene, if people are familiar with that term. Anthropocene meaning the massive impact of human habit and human cultures and society upon the natural environment and the Earth system. Sister Cities of Climate Change is a proposition. It's a proposal. Right now, it's a thought experiment, but it might become something real and manifest. An installation, perhaps, maybe a series of art installations or events that shows the connectivity between places that are losing ice, places like Iceland and Greenland, but also any of the other places in the world that have glaciers and ice sheets, and how those connect to these cities that are being inundated by that meltwater. And so the idea here is to try and bring that awareness, that attunement to this dynamic, and also to begin to think together about how we might make resolutions and solutions to change. So sister cities of the climate change. I'll put that out there. And so if anyone has great ideas about how that might become manifest about how we might enact a project like this. I would love to hear about that because I'm very excited about the possibility, but I think there's lots of directions and ways it could go. Thank you.
Thank you for your inputs, and then we would move into the discussion. And if you at home have any questions for Cymene and Sophie, don't hesitate to write them in the Q&A function. And thank you.
It looks like there is one in here already. Julian, should I just read that out? This one's for you, Sophie. What is the total investment needed to get Stuttgart to zero emissions? How much is approved, and how will the rest be financed?
That's yeah, actually I had to look this up. And it's a substantial number. It's actually, we are talking about 11 billion euros on additional investments that would be needed. And then the tricky thing is with, you know, such studies and roadmaps and, let's say, more strategic plans that obviously these investments, they go into very different sectors. So the strategy looks at, you know, mobility solutions, energy, heating, waste, buildings, many different sectors, which obviously also involve many different actors. So it's not really said that this comes from one source and it can be approved by one actor itself, but it's many stakeholders involved, many approval processes involved, more or less. And it's really more trying to make the case for it and showing that everyone has a role to play here. And obviously the municipality itself, they will look into let's say, their own levers and their own financial contributions and means and instruments, such as the Innovation Fund, for instance, on how to contribute here. But it's, as I said before, it's a task for whole of society. So yeah, it's not as easy as to say, well, have we spent this money? How much is still missing? Where do we get it from? But it's, I think, an iteratively process also. That is just yeah, about to roll out. And I mean, I'll put a link in the chat, so if you're interested in the roadmap itself and the work around it, you can check some of the slides and outcomes, which I think are quite well presented here. Yeah, I hope it answered the question. Yeah,
yeah, and I think yeah. Okay. Yeah, I also, I really learned a lot in your presentation, Sophie, about too that Stuttgart would become the hottest city in Germany. And then again, this question of heavy rain. And I think you also said that this Climate Innovation Fund is perhaps the largest fund for climate adaptation in all of Europe, which is amazing that, that the city and other partners have been able to enact that. I was also very interested in the fact that the Nature Conservancy has a program to focus on cities. I think that's critically important. That, again, as I sort of alluded to in this discussion, that we cannot continue to think of nature as something separate and distinct and different, something that's out there, over there, like nature is in the parks or nature is out in the woods. Nature is everywhere with us and around us. And we are affecting it. It is affecting us. And that's why I think that, you know, this idea of the urban environment is really important, because cities are in environments, right? I mean, I think we do tend to think of cities as these built places that are very human constructed, and they're sort of walled off from the so-called natural world, but they're certainly not. And one of the things that climate change is forcing us to see is that the urban environment is in fact an environment, and it exists within an environment, and it can be affected very dramatically by changes in that environment, whether it's rain and flooding or heat and drought, et cetera. I mean, whatever the impact is, that it really forces us to kind of to contend with that. And so I think that's one of the really important things that I heard and saw throughout your presentation, is really tuning into the fact that the urban is not separate from environment, but it is in fact an interrelated nexus of process.
Yeah,
That's not really a question. It's just a sort of a statement.
Yeah, but it's a really good thought, and it's exactly, this, mindset also, or this realization that we try to further promote and explore. That I would even say, I mean, humans are part of nature. We are also ourselves part of nature. So there is no, we and us, and especially in the urban sphere, and we talk about climate risks, then there is often this, notion of we have to protect ourselves from nature. We have to build artificial structures to separate us from nature, to avoid water reaching us, or have this kind of separation there. And I think this is kind of it's obviously one way, and in certain, areas, it's obviously also needed measures to protect livelihoods and have these structures in mind. But the nature-based solutions approach is also exploring this other way of seeing, let us try work with nature, and as part of nature to kind of establish these systems, and also learn from nature that has had so many years to evolve, more or less, on how to adapt to these climate change issues, and work together instead of against each other. So have this a bit more holistic approach. And and it was actually leading to a thought also that I had when I saw your presentation, because you obviously had a much more, I would say, international and also social, perspective to these issues. And I was wondering if, since you have traveled these different places from Iceland to Honolulu, and you have experienced how people already, experience the losses of glaciers, the, road incidents, the sea level rise. So do you see a big difference in terms of the culture and how people, see this relationship to water and climate change, and how they approach it, how they perhaps also, like, with what kind of attitude they see this hydrological globalization that you described? Were there some things that, stuck with you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've noticed really prominently is that these changes are pushing people generally to kind of reckon with place more deeply, to really think more about place and what it means to them, and what it's meant historically, and how it might be in the future, and what they can expect for the next generations of children and grandchildren. There was a wonderful poet and filmmaker and environmental activist that I worked with in Iceland, Andrei Snær Magnusson, who talks about when his grandparents would go across the glaciers in Iceland, and then when his grandparents did this, the glaciers were forever. Like this, the idea was that it was forever, and there was no question that glaciers wouldn't exist in the future. And now what we're seeing, as he points out, is that a glacier could die between and totally disappear between the day that someone is born and the day that they become the age of his grandparents. So within a human lifetime. And so some of these changes are encouraging or forcing or challenging us to think differently about time and about place and about how we interact with those times and places. In Hawaii, I mean, that's another fascinating place. Of course, it's a place that's been very dependent upon the sea forever. In more traditional and the kind of ancient traditional Hawaiian forms, each landmass was designated from the very top of the mountain all the way out to the reef. That was a political unit. You begin in the mountain where the rain falls in the tropics, and you have this wonderful rainfall, and you can grow things up there. That rainfall becomes a river which flows down to the coast. You have fish ponds that exist along the coast, and you can cultivate and harvest these fish. And the stretch of your political unit, like your area, your environment, goes all the way out to the reef, out in the ocean. So these are different ways of conceptualizing political boundaries and political constellations. They're very different than the settler colonial forms that we have in the United States, right? Which draw lines in certain ways that sometimes don't make as much sense as they should, right? So I'm seeing a lot of really diverse and sort of different approaches to responding, but that are unique and really fascinating in the way that people are contending with these changes. I haven't done the field work in Greenland yet. I'm super excited to go do that. And I haven't done the field work yet in Cape Town. So we'll see how that goes as well. But it's an ongoing project.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
So I see there are a few more questions.
Oh, okay, great.
Sure. Perhaps we can go from the top. It's a bit of a pity that there is no, function to unmute and ask directly, but let's try to make the best out of it. So there's one saying, is there something everyone can do to help the climate locally? What kinds of effects of climate change can we already see in the cities of Germany and America? So
I can say, well, you think about that, because I think this is really a great question for you, Sophie. I'll just throw out a couple of things. I don't know if people here in the room are aware of the C40, which is the cities. It's an organization of cities that are really committed to climate mitigation, that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also climate adaptation. And many people believe that cities are really leading the way. Like cities are really, city government at that scale, large cities, important cities all over the world are really leading the way much more than individual countries are in terms of making these adaptations to climate and to preventing more greenhouse gas emissions. So I think, being on board with that, supporting the work of the C40 cities is really important. And I don't know, maybe you have some other things that you can say about the case of Germany and the cities of Germany.
Yeah, I mean, I think the effects are quite common, probably also for, cities in Germany and America. So usually, I mean, I showed this first slide, it's a lot about urban heat, kind of, because we have lots of concrete and lots of houses and built up structures, streets, which are kind of made of, let's say, black concrete, which stores heat. So there are lots of cars that store heat. So there are really nice figures, for instance, showing a street that is completely greened, where there are street trees and so on, and they show you the surface temperature of this street in comparison to a street where there is no greenery at all, and it's all full of parked cars that were in the full sun, for the whole day and heated up. And the difference is tremendous. So it's really a big difference. And this is probably goes back to what can everyone do to actually help the climate locally. To start thinking about the place where I actually live, my house, my garden, perhaps. How can I there, create more greenery or structures which actually help cooling down the place? So how can I plant more plants, for instance, very easily? Is there a way to green my roof, my facade, for instance? Is there a way that I can depave areas that are just full of concrete? Can I take this out? Can I renature some of those parts? That's probably something that everyone can start think of. And it can be small, can be just a small urban garden. It can also be bigger if I'm planning to renovate, for instance. So that's small steps, I would say, just to adapt. And obviously, when doing so, it is important to also look at what kind of plants do I select. Are they plants that need a lot of water? What can I do to save water? For instance, when I wash my vegetables, can I use this water to water my plants? Or do I need to actually use fresh water, which is such a precious resource and which will become less and less in the future? So what can I do to capture rainwater, for instance, and use it? And there are different systems that have it, incorporated in the house, that the toilet flushes with rainwater, for instance, instead of fresh water. But it could also be just for watering purposes, or to create a small pond and keep water in the pond. So, I mean, these are perhaps some thoughts and some smaller things one can do, some bigger things one can do, but there's definitely a lot of potential already there and everyone can contribute to it. So that's my thoughts on this question.
That's great. And then the other thing I might add to that is that anything that you can think of to do that helps the climate crisis, whether that is greening spaces like a rooftop or a facade, whether it's using less fossil fuels in one way or another, whether it's reducing your consumption of commercial goods or meat products or all these things that have an impact on the environment. Instead of doing it yourself, get a group of people to do it together. Get your apartment building to do it together. Get your block, your neighborhood to do it. Get your family to do it with you. Instead of, because I think we always feel like, oh, as an individual, there's nothing I can do myself that's going to make a huge impact. And that's true because we live in these structures and these systems that make it very difficult for us to kind of make these changes. But if you work with other people and get other people on board, both it's more fun and more gratifying, and also you're having a bigger effect overall. So whatever good ideas you have for helping combat the climate crisis, I'd say get collective about it and find groups of people that you can do that with.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Do you want to, you should answer number 2 there, Sophie. It says, how will Berlin partner with Stuttgart? Will there be more German cities involved?
Yes, so in Berlin, TNC has a slightly different approach. It's also, there's one person of TNC working in the municipality itself, but they look more at strategic, let's say, work in that sense. So they are creating, for instance, GIS maps, like planning maps and analyzing data on which buildings could be greened, what is the potential that is there. Having a green roof cadastre, for instance, which could then be used by city planners in their future projects as a baseline. So it's not so much implementation oriented as here in Stuttgart, and it's not so much working with external organizations, but it's very, planning, based on the planning process itself. And I think this is something that we try to then in the program bring together and say, what can we do from a strategic point of view? What can we do, with individual real implementation on the ground projects? And how can we bring these learnings together? And there is not so much exchange yet between the two cities, but this is something that we plan on enhancing. And once the projects kick off a bit more, to actually focus a bit more also on the exchange there. And the overall program also foresees at least one other city to become a partner there. And I mean, TNC's approach was always to see what do the partners bring on board, what are their current needs and priorities, and then build up the program around this. So, which I think is a very good approach as well. No?
All right, I think slowly we would have to wrap up, but there's one more question that I might want to direct to both of you. There's a guest writing about the lack of urgency of climate change in the public sphere, and they are wondering what kind of public education or in what ways climate change and the urgency of climate change could be brought into the larger public. Is there anything that both Stuttgart and maybe Houston do to bring that to the forefront?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'll just start. It's a tricky question because usually when you work in a bit of a climate bubble, you kind of feel like everyone is talking about it, everyone is trying to work on it. Why is it not rolling? Why is it not going faster, more or less? And I think it's a lot about moving out of the bubble, kind of reaching new target groups. This is also something that's very often debated in the, selection, project selection within the jury here in Stuttgart, is to say, how can we actually reach the non-usual suspects? How can we promote projects which reach different type of citizens here in Stuttgart. And it also is trying a bit to kind of see how can we build up a movement which is not only based on, anxiety and fear as such, but is also motivating and showing, what is the benefit for myself? Because in the end, this is often, for people that are maybe not intrinsically motivated or working in that field, this is kind of the question they ask, what's the benefit for myself? And we saw, for instance, with the energy crisis during winter, that there was, for instance, one project that kicked off with a large energy saving campaign, and what individuals can do to reduce their energy bill in that sense, and switch to improve heating and energy efficiency. And I think these are kind of the, let's say, ways to get people to understand the full picture and kind of see that, climate is so huge. There are so many different ways to contribute and become active. And perhaps I'm not a person who, can easily give up the car, because I don't live, I live in a bit of a rural area, for instance. But still, there are perhaps other ways, where I can contribute better. So I think this is a bit, perhaps in that regard, there is, for instance, in Stuttgart, a climate community by now. It's been a digital platform, but they also host different, contests, for instance, for people to bring in their ideas or their life hacks or whatever they plan to do. And when they look for people to join them in different initiatives around climate. So it's kind of an endeavor to bring together different people to exchange on these issues, like Facebook or so, but on local climate action in that terms. So that was also something that's, an interesting project around here. Yeah.
I mean, I like the way that the person who asked the question asked about public education. I think that that's a great idea to really actively integrate discussion and the science of climate and the social side of climate change and adaptation into curricula, into the school system. And I think in a place like Germany, you could do that very successfully. In a place like Texas, I mean, we can barely even teach evolution in some school districts in the United States. So we're really far behind in terms of public education, but in other parts of the world, I think we can do that. The place we need to do these sorts of things, of course, is places like Texas that are producing all these fossil fuels. The other thing I'll just add as a final note maybe is that I think it's really important that we start having more climate discussion. And as you said, Sophie, to reduce some of the negativity around it by integrating it more clearly into the media space, having TV shows that have some kind of climate occurrence, like some kind of climate event or is happening in every single TV show or movie that gets produced, so that it becomes kind of part of the larger consciousness, the larger public consciousness, in ways that goes beyond simply reports from the IPCC, which people have become really deaf to. I think it's gotten very hard for people to listen to the science anymore. They don't want to hear these depressing stories. It's become exhausting. And so we need to innovate new ways of talking about this, not to make it fun exactly, but to make it intrinsically interesting and part of our larger cultural fabric. So however we can do that, that's, I think, a good way forward.
Thank you. Wonderful. And I think also events like the one tonight are a good way to bring it into the discussion. So thank you very much, Cymene Howe and Sophie Mok, for joining tonight and for this very insightful discussion. From the local to the global scope of climate change. I want to thank Marion Danzeisen and Christiane Pücker from the German-American Center in Stuttgart, as well as Monika Renninger from the Bildungszentrum Evangelischer Hospitalhof, for their support in organizing the head-to-head series with us in Stuttgart. And I also want to thank Bertolt Leibinger Foundation and especially their managing director, Markus Wehner, as well as Holzbrink Publishing Group for their continued support in this series. And I want to thank you all for joining tonight, and cordially invite you out to join other events at the DRZ or the Hospitalhof, or many other events at the American Academy in Berlin if you ever get a chance to come out to Wannsee. So thank you very much and have a good night.
Everyone, thank you everyone. Have a
Thank
good evening.
you.
Bye.